The unexpected intruder. The Starfall drifted silently through the vast emptiness of space, its engines humming in the quiet. Captain Daniel Cross leaned back in his chair, eyes half-lidded as he stared at the stars. Another long, uneventful night. Just how he liked it. His ship wasn't fancy, just an old cargo hauler with upgraded thrusters and a few hidden tricks. It was his home, his livelihood, and most importantly, it was his, until the alarms went off. A loud blaring siren shattered the silence. Red warning lights flashed across the control panel. Unauthorized access detected in the cockpit. Daniel bolted upright, his pulse quickening. That wasn't possible. The ship was locked. He was the only one on board. Unless... He grabbed his blaster from the side holster and moved quickly, his footsteps silent against the metal floor. His heart pounded in his chest, but his grip was steady. He had been through too many spaceport brawls and close calls to panic now. The cockpit door was partially open, a faint glow spilling out. Someone was inside. Taking a deep breath, Daniel pushed the door open with his foot and raised his blaster. "Step away from the controls," he ordered. The figure at the console froze. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, the intruder turned around. Daniel's breath caught. She wasn't human. The woman standing before him had glowing violet eyes that shone in the dim light. Her skin was smooth and silver-toned, almost metallic but warm-looking. Strange, delicate markings pulsed with energy along her arms, disappearing under her torn, dark jumpsuit. She looked injured, one hand pressed against her side, where a faint trace of silver-blue blood stained the fabric. And yet, despite her wounds, she didn't look afraid. Instead, she glared at him with defiance, her fingers still hovering over the ship's controls. Daniel's grip on the blaster tightened. "I said, step away." She exhaled, frustration flickering across her face. Then, without warning, she lunged. Daniel barely had time to react before she slammed into him. His blaster was knocked from his hand, clattering onto the floor. The woman moved fast, too fast. He barely caught her wrist before she could strike again. "Damn it," Daniel growled, struggling to hold her back. "You break into my ship, try to steal it, and now you want to fight." She gritted her teeth, pushing against him. Even injured, she was strong. Stronger than she should have been. "I don't have time for this," she hissed, her voice sharp but undeniably human-like. Daniel used his weight to twist her arm, flipping her onto the floor. She landed with a grunt, gasping in pain as her wound pressed against the metal. That gave him enough time to pin her down, one knee against her back. She struggled beneath him, but her strength was fading. Her breath was ragged, her movements slower. "Who the hell are you?" Daniel demanded. "And why are you trying to steal my ship?" She didn't answer at first, just lay there, breathing heavily. Then, in a voice so soft he barely heard it, she whispered, "They're coming." Daniel frowned. "Who?" A warning flashed on his control screen. "Incoming ship these DTECTED. Multiple locos." Daniel's stomach dropped. He turned toward the screen, his pulse quickening. 3 ships were heading straight for them, closing in fast. He looked back at the woman beneath him. Fear flickered in her eyes now. She wasn't lying. Someone really was coming for her. "Listen to me," she said, her voice urgent. "You need to take off. Right now." Daniel didn't like taking orders, especially from someone who just tried to steal his damned ship. But something about the way she said it, the sheer desperation in her voice, made him pause. The ship's warning alarms grew louder. Enemy ships were locking onto him. Daniel cursed under his breath. This was not his fight. He could shove this girl off his ship, let her deal with whoever was after her, and go back to his life. That would be the smart move. But then, he saw the way she was looking at him now. Not with defiance, not with anger, but with silent resignation. Like she already knew what was going to happen to her. Like she had already accepted her fate. Something about that didn't sit right with him. With a low growl, Daniel grabbed the ship's controls and powered up the engines. The thrusters roared to life, shaking the entire vessel as he prepared for an emergency takeoff. The woman blinked in shock. You're actually helping me." Daniel shot her a glare. "I don't like people telling me what to do, so I'm making this choice for myself." The enemy ships were almost on top of them now. Daniel punched the thrusters. The Starfall shot forward, engines screaming, just as the first enemy blast fired, narrowly missing them. The woman slumped back against the seat, breathing hard. Daniel glanced at her. "You better start explaining," he said, "because I just made a very stupid decision." She let out a tired laugh. "Yeah, you did. A desperate escape." The Starfall roared through the void, engines burning at full thrust as it fled from the incoming ships. The control panel blazed with warnings. Enemy ships were gaining fast. Daniel gripped the controls, his jaw clenched. This was not how his day was supposed to go. Behind him, the mysterious alien woman slumped into the co-pilot's seat, still breathing hard. Her silver-toned skin glowed faintly in the dim cockpit lights, but the tension in her body told him she wasn't relaxed. She was waiting for the next attack. Daniel glanced at her. "All right. Start talking. Who the hell are they?" She wiped blood from her lip, staring at the incoming ships on the radar. "Zenith Dominion Enforcers." Daniel frowned. "Never heard of them." She let out a bitter laugh. "That's because they don't want you to." The ship lurched violently as a plasma bolt grazed the hull. Sparks exploded from one of the panels. "War and Ning. She ELDs at 72%. Daniel cursed under his breath, pushing the thrusters harder. "I need more than cryptic answers, lady. Who are you? And why are they hunting you?" She hesitated, then finally muttered, "My name is Kyra, and I wasn't trying to steal your ship." Daniel scoffed. "Oh, because that's exactly what it looked like." Kyra shot him a sharp glare. "I needed to activate your ship's transponder codes." Daniel blinked. "What?" She turned back to the screen. "Zenith Dominion ships have security tracking. Only a registered human vessel could override their scanners long enough for me to escape." Daniel felt his stomach drop. "So you thought my ship was your ticket out of here?" Kyra exhaled. "Not a thought. It was my only choice." Daniel's hands tightened on the controls. He had been used. He didn't like that. Before he could snap back, another plasma blast streaked past the ship. Kyra's violet eyes narrowed. "We won't outrun them for long. You need to jump." Daniel gritted his teeth. "I'm working on it." The jump drive was still charging. They had 30 seconds before they could enter hyperspace, and the enemy wasn't giving them that long. A battle in the stars. The enemy ships closed in. Sleek, dark fighters, their thrusters leaving an eerie blue glow in the void. They moved like hunters circling prey. Daniel's radar pinged aggressively. More lock-ons. Kyra's expression darkened. "They won't destroy us yet. They'll disable the ship first. They want me alive." Daniel's grip on the controls tightened. "Well, that's just great. And what about me?" Kyra's jaw tensed. "They'll kill you. Quickly, if you're lucky." Daniel muttered a curse. "Even better." The ship's AI voice rang out. "Target Loxi KDT KTD. Missile incoming." Daniel's gut twisted. A missile. Kyra's eyes widened. "You need to." Daniel was already moving. He yanked the controls, sending the Starfall into a brutal barrel roll. The missile narrowly missed, streaking past them and detonating in the distance. The shockwave slammed into the ship, making every system flicker. Kyra gripped the seat, eyes wide. "You fly like a madman." Daniel smirked. "You haven't seen anything yet." He hit the weapons panel. Turrets deployed. Auto-fire engaged. The ship spat out a stream of laser fire, forcing the enemy fighters to break formation. One enemy ship took a direct hit, spinning into flames. Kyra stared at him in shock. You're armed. Daniel grinned. What kind of idiot flies through deep space unarmed? Kyra muttered something in her own language that Daniel was pretty sure wasn't a compliment. Another explosion rocked the ship. Daniel glanced at the screen. 10 seconds until the jump drive was ready. Kyra was already moving, pulling up a secondary console. I'll handle countermeasures. Just get us to the jump point. Daniel didn't argue. The enemy fighters regrouped. More blasts lit up the darkness. Kyra slammed a hand on the controls. A pulse wave exploded from the ship, scrambling enemy targeting systems. Daniel gritted his teeth. The jump drive timer hit 0. Hold on. He punched the hyperdrive activation. The Starfall shuddered, engines whining as the fabric of space stretched. And then they vanished. Silence after the storm. The ship dropped out of hyperspace, drifting into a quiet sector of deep space. No stars, no planets, just darkness. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his temples. Kyra leaned back in her seat, eyes closed. That was close. Daniel glared at her. That was stupid. Kyra let out a weak chuckle. Stupid, but it worked. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. All right, now that we're not dead, you're going to explain. Why is the Zenith Dominion after you? Kyra's expression darkened. For the first time, she looked uncertain. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, because I know the truth, and they'll do anything to keep it buried. Daniel's stomach twisted. That didn't sound good. The truth about the stolen ship. The Starfall drifted silently in the deep void, hidden from enemy sensors. Inside the cockpit, Daniel cross-folded his arms, his sharp blue eyes locked onto Kyra, the mysterious alien who had just turned his life upside down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, space stretched endlessly, peaceful compared to the chaos they had just escaped. But inside, the air was thick with tension. Daniel leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the console. All right, let's hear it. What truth is worth all of that? Kyra hesitated. Her violet eyes flickered with something unreadable. Fear, guilt, regret. Finally, she sighed. You were never supposed to get involved. Daniel scoffed. Yeah. Well, guess what? You hijacked my ship. Got me nearly blown up. I think I'm involved now. Kyra closed her eyes for a moment, then nodded. Fine. You deserve to know. She leaned forward, her fingers dancing over the ship's holo console. With a few swift commands, the display flickered to life, revealing a 3D star map. At the center, one name glowed red, Zenith Prime. Daniel's jaw tightened, the Dominion's homeworld. Kyra nodded, the heart of their empire, and the place where I was created. Daniel stilled. Created. Kyra met his gaze. I'm not what you think I am, Daniel. I wasn't born. I was made. The experiment that shouldn't exist. Kyra took a deep breath before continuing. The Zenith Dominion controls genetic evolution. Their rulers believe in perfection, in creating life forms stronger, faster, better than anything natural. Daniel's stomach twisted. He had heard rumors. Cloning, genetic engineering, soldiers bred for war. But this, they call us the Ascended. Kyra's voice was bitter. Modified beings, engineered to be obedient, flawless. Weapons. Daniel frowned. Then why are they trying to kill you? Kyra's lips curled into a humorless smile. Because I'm broken. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You don't look broken to me. Kyra exhaled. Because you don't know what I was supposed to be. She tapped the holo console again, and a different file appeared. It was a list of names. Dozens of them. No, hundreds. All marked T-R-M-I-N-A-T-E. Daniel's pulse quickened. What is this? Kyra's voice was flat. The list of every failed experiment before me. Daniel's blood ran cold. They killed them. Kyra's violet eyes burned with something dark. The Dominion doesn't accept failure. The secret she stole. Daniel's mind raced. This wasn't just about one escaped experiment. This was bigger. You weren't just running, were you? He asked. Kyra shook her head. No, I stole something. She pulled a small metallic drive from her belt and placed it on the table between them. This, she said, contains every classified file on the Ascended project. The truth about what they did. The experiments. The genetic harvesting. The people they erased. Daniel stared at the device. This wasn't just dangerous. It was suicide. Kyra's voice dropped to a whisper. I wasn't just trying to escape. I was trying to end them. A long silence followed. Daniel rubbed his temples. He had been a simple trader, a smuggler when needed, but never a hero. Now he was sitting across from the most wanted fugitive in the galaxy, holding a secret that could bring down the most powerful empire known to man. And the worst part, he wasn't sure he wanted to walk away. The human who wasn't supposed to exist. Daniel exhaled. Okay, so you hijacked my ship to run from an empire that wants you dead. You stole their biggest secret. And now, I'm screwed because I helped you. Kyra's lips twitched slightly. That about sums it up. Daniel sighed, rubbing his chin. Fantastic. Then Kyra hesitated. A flicker of doubt crossed her face. There's something else. Daniel narrowed his eyes. Now what? Kyra hesitated, then tapped a few more commands into the holo console. The files changed. A DNA sequence appeared, pulsing in red. Daniel frowned. What am I looking at? Kyra's fingers tightened on the table. That's your DNA. Daniel froze. What? Kyra's violet eyes locked onto his. I scanned you back on the ship. Your DNA isn't normal. A cold sensation crawled up Daniel's spine. Kyra continued. You carry genetic markers that shouldn't exist in any living human. Daniel's voice was hoarse. Explain. Kyra swallowed. The last human they experimented on was over 100 years ago. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Kyra leaned forward, voice low. And you match him exactly. Who, or what, is Daniel? Daniel's mind reeled. This wasn't possible. He was just a pilot, a nobody, a man who had fought, survived, and made his way through the galaxy without any special heritage, lineage, or destiny. But if what Kyra was saying was true, if his DNA was identical to a classified Zenith experiment from a century ago, then he wasn't just involved in her story. He was part of it. Kyra studied him carefully. The Zenith Dominion doesn't erase people for no reason. They only erase threats. Daniel clenched his fists. And what does that make me? Kyra's lips pressed into a thin line. A mistake, she whispered. A human that was never supposed to exist. A mistake the galaxy forgot. The starfall hummed softly in the silence of deep space. Daniel sat at the cockpit console, staring at the DNA sequence glowing red on the holoscreen. His heart pounded in his chest, his hands clenched into fists. Kyra sat across from him, watching, waiting. Her violet eyes were sharp but uncertain, as if she wasn't sure what to say next. Daniel let out a slow breath. You're wrong. Kyra arched an eyebrow. About what? Daniel shook his head. About me. I'm nobody. I grew up on a backwater colony, running scrap jobs and avoiding trouble. I'm not some. He gestured to the screen. Genetic experiment. Kyra's lips pressed into a thin line. I didn't say you were an experiment. I said you weren't supposed to exist. Daniel exhaled through his nose. Same thing. Kyra leaned forward. No, it's not. She tapped the holoscreen, bringing up an old Zenith file. The document flickered with static before stabilizing. Project NOVA, CUBG-CT13. Daniel froze. Below the heading was a grainy image of a man in a military uniform. His face was younger, sharper, but undeniably him. His own face stared back at him from a document that had to be over 100 years old. The file listed genetic modifications, classified notes, and one disturbing final entry. Status. T-R-M-I-N-A-T-E-D. Daniel's breath caught. Kyra's voice was quiet but firm. "Explain that, Captain." "The human who should have died." Daniel forced himself to speak. This has to be a mistake." Kyra didn't blink. The Zenith Dominion doesn't make mistakes. He stood abruptly, pacing the small cockpit, his thoughts racing. This wasn't possible. He had a normal life. Well, as normal as life got in the outer systems. There were no gaps in his memory, no missing years, no strange signs that he was anything but human. And yet, he never got sick. He never broke a bone. And he never, not once, had a medical record past childhood. Daniel rubbed his temples. "No, this can't be right." Kyra leaned back in her chair. "You think I want this to be true?" She gestured to the file. "I spent my whole life being told I was created to serve the Zenith. But you?" She shook her head. "You're something worse to them." Daniel frowned. "And what's that?" Kyra's eyes darkened. "A ghost." Daniel's stomach twisted. "The reason they're after me," Kyra continued, "is because I escaped with this information. The truth about their genetic projects, their failures, their cover-ups." She tapped the screen, and the image zoomed in on the final entry of Project Nova. Subdgct 13 Tirameninate Year 4190. Cause of DAT. System failure. Status. ERAS deed. Warum Uricordis. Daniel swallowed hard. The current galactic year was 4295. According to Zenith records, Kyra murmured, "You died over 100 years ago." Who was Daniel Cross? Daniel sank back into his chair. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was blank. Kyra watched him carefully. "I don't think you're a clone. If they recreated you, they wouldn't be hunting you now." Daniel exhaled. "Then what am I?" Kyra hesitated, choosing her words carefully. The Zenith Dominion doesn't erase people unless they're a threat. If they covered up your existence, it means you were dangerous to them. Daniel scoffed. "Yeah, because a cargo pilot is a real danger to a galactic empire." Kyra's gaze didn't waver. "Maybe you were, once." Silence filled the cockpit. Daniel clenched his fists. He didn't know what was worse, that the Zenith might have created him, or that he was once someone dangerous, and didn't remember. He forced himself to focus. "All right, let's say you're right. Let's say the Dominion wiped my history. What now?" Kyra leaned forward. "We find out why." The last lead. Kyra pulled up another file. This one encrypted, its data corrupted. "This," she said, "is the only lead I have left." The document's title flickered. Project Innova. Final location. Site Belak. Daniel frowned. "Never heard of it." Kyra nodded. "You wouldn't have. It doesn't exist on any star map." Daniel exhaled. "And let me guess. You want to go there." Kyra met his gaze. "If you want answers, that's where we'll find them." Daniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. This was insane. He had no reason to trust her, no reason to believe he was anything more than what he'd always been. But deep inside, something whispered to him. A memory, a feeling, a distant echo of a life he couldn't recall. He clenched his jaw. "Fine," he said. "We go to Site Black." Kyra nodded. Daniel flicked the ship's controls. The engines rumbled to life. Then, ALERT. Incoming signal. Daniel's eyes snapped to the radar. A distress beacon. Kyra stiffened. "It's a trap." Daniel hesitated. The signal repeated, weak and fragmented. "This is U.S. Tempest. Request assistance. Zen. Static. Kyra's hand hovered over her weapon. The Dominion knows we're here. Daniel's stomach twisted. If it was a trap, the Dominion was already on their trail. If it was real, someone else was out there, and they needed help. Daniel's fingers hovered over the control panel. Choice. Investigate the distress signal. Risk walking into an ambush. Ignore it, and go to Site Black. Focus on finding answers. Daniel exhaled. Then he made his choice. The distress signal that shouldn't exist. The Starfall hummed softly, its engines idling as Daniel stared at the blinking distress signal on the console. The transmission was weak, fragmented by static, but the name had been clear. U.S. Tempest. Kyra sat beside him, her violet eyes locked onto the screen, tense and unmoving. I'm telling you, it's a trap. Daniel exhaled slowly. Maybe. But if it's real. He looked at her. Then someone's out there. And they need help. Kyra's jaw tightened. I don't think you understand, Captain. The U.S. Tempest disappeared 50 years ago. Daniel froze. What? Kyra tapped the holoconsole, pulling up an old military archive. A grainy image of a large warship flickered onto the screen, its hull scarred from battle. The Tempest was one of the last human warships to resist the Zenith Dominion before the war ended. It was presumed destroyed in a final battle near the Black Nebula. Daniel's pulse quickened. A ship lost 50 years ago, sending a distress call now. This doesn't make sense, he muttered. Kyra nodded. No, it doesn't. But then, the signal changed. A new message crackled through the static. If anyone is out there, please, they found us. We can't hold them off. A sharp metallic screech filled the cockpit. Then silence. Daniel and Kyra exchanged glances. Then, New Yugu Kiku Ordinakius, Reciivit. A set of space coordinates flashed on the screen. Daniel swallowed hard. Someone, or something, had just sent them a location, and it was deep inside the Black Nebula. A dangerous decision. Kyra stood up, crossing her arms. This is a Zenith Dominion trick. They want to lure us in. Daniel studied the coordinates. And if it's not? Kyra scoffed. You really think a 50-year-old ship just happened to call for help right now, in the exact sector we're heading toward? Daniel leaned back, running a hand through his hair. It was insane. And yet, something about this felt personal, like he was meant to find it. Daniel clenched his jaw. I can't ignore it. Kyra sighed, rubbing her temples. You're impossible. He smirked. Yeah, well, get used to it. Kyra shook her head but sat back down. Fine. But the second this looks bad, we get the hell out. Daniel nodded. He flipped the thrusters online. The Starfall turned toward the Black Nebula, engines burning as it shot into the darkness. The Black Nebula, a graveyard of ships. As the Starfall entered the nebula, the stars vanished. Thick clouds of black gas swirled outside, swallowing all light. Even the ship's external lights struggled against the overwhelming darkness. Daniel tightened his grip on the controls. This place is unnatural. Kyra checked the scanners. Electromagnetic interference is off the charts. If anything goes wrong, we're blind. Daniel exhaled. Great. Then, the first wreckage appeared. A massive destroyer-class warship floated lifelessly in the dark, its hull torn apart by plasma fire. More ships emerged from the fog. Some were human warships, others Zenith cruisers, all of them dead. Daniel's skin prickled. This isn't just a battlefield. Kyra's voice was quiet. It's a graveyard. Suddenly, ping. The distress signal flared again, stronger than before. Kyra's eyes widened. We're close. Daniel adjusted the ship's course, weaving through the wreckage. His fingers hovered over the thruster controls, ready for anything. Then they saw it. The U.S. Tempest. The legendary warship drifted ahead, half buried in the nebula's shadows. Its hull was cracked, its engines lifeless. And yet, its distress beacon was still active. Kira tensed. "I don't like this." Daniel exhaled. "Me neither." But they had come this far. And he needed answers. Boarding the ghost ship, Daniel docked the Starfall onto the Tempest's airlock. The connection hissed as it sealed. The ship was deathly silent. No response. No movement. Kyra unholstered her energy pistol. "Stay close." Daniel smirked. "I was planning on running off into the dark alone, actually." Kyra rolled her eyes. "Why do I trust you with my life again?" Daniel chuckled, but his grip tightened on his blaster. The airlock doors creaked open. A wave of cold air rushed out. They stepped inside. The corridor was dimly lit, covered in frost. The emergency lights flickered, casting eerie shadows along the walls. Daniel frowned. "How is there still power?" Kyra checked her scanner. "This ship should be dead, but something is keeping it alive." Daniel's pulse quickened. Then a sound. A faint whisper. His breath hitched. "Did you hear that?" Kyra's eyes narrowed. "Yeah." The whisper came again. Faint, distorted. "Who's there?" Daniel and Kira froze. Then, the lights flashed red. An alarm blared through the ship. "Warning. INTURED. Kyra's voice sharpened. "Move. Now." They bolted forward just as the airlock slammed shut behind them. The Tempest had locked them in. Daniel's stomach twisted. Something was still alive on this ship. And now, it knew they were here. The ghost that waited. The air was thick, heavy with something unseen. Daniel's breath came slow and controlled as he moved through the frozen corridors of the U.S. Tempest. Every step echoed in the eerie silence. Kyra walked beside him, her energy pistol raised, scanning every dark corner. The ship's red warning lights pulsed, casting shifting shadows across the walls. The airlock behind them had slammed shut. They were trapped. And yet, the whispering continued. "Who's there?" The voice drifted from the corridor ahead, distant but undeniable. Not static, not an automated message. A real voice. Daniel clenched his jaw. This ship was lost 50 years ago. That's impossible. Kyra's violet eyes narrowed. Impossible doesn't mean safe. They pressed forward, stepping into the main corridor. The walls were lined with frost, and a thin mist clung to the floor, swirling as they moved. Then the lights flickered, and for a split second, Daniel saw movement. A shadow darting ahead. His grip tightened on his blaster. "We're not alone." Kyra checked her scanner. "I'm reading faint life signs, but they're distorted." She frowned. "It's like whoever's here isn't fully in phase with this reality." Daniel's pulse quickened. That didn't sound good. Then, a metallic clang echoed through the ship. Kyra spun around, weapon raised. What was that? Daniel exhaled. Nothing good. The ship's automated voice suddenly crackled to life. "Warning. Unauthorized presence EDTECTED." Daniel's blood ran cold. Something else knew they were here. The first survivor. They moved deeper into the ship, following the faint life signs Kyra had detected. The Tempest was a tomb. The walls were lined with frozen bodies, crew members, preserved in ice. Their expressions were locked in terror, as if they had seen something before they died. Daniel's stomach twisted. What the hell happened here? Kyra ran her fingers over one of the frozen panels. Something powerful, something unnatural. Then, a cough. Daniel spun, weapon raised. "Did you hear that?" Kyra nodded, eyes sharp. "Someone's alive." They rushed toward the source, a locked medical bay at the end of the corridor. Kyra worked the console, overriding the system. The door groaned before hissing open. Inside, a man lay slumped against the wall, barely breathing. His uniform was torn, and his skin was unnaturally pale. His eyes fluttered open as he saw them. No, no, you shouldn't be here. Daniel knelt beside him. We got your distress call. The man shook his head weakly. That wasn't me. Daniel's blood turned to ice. Kyra tensed. Then who sent it? The man's eyes darkened. It did. The lights flickered violently. The air grew colder. And from the corridor behind them, the whispering voice returned. Leave, before it wakes. Then, the deep guttural growl. The entity in the dark. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to move. A shadow loomed at the far end of the corridor, its form twisting unnaturally. Humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs moved like liquid, shifting between solid and ethereal. Kyra cursed. What the hell is that? Daniel pulled the injured survivor onto his feet. We need to go. Now. The figure lurched forward, its body glitching through the frozen walls. You shouldn't be here. The voice echoed inside their minds, a sickening presence pressing against their thoughts. Daniel gritted his teeth. Run. Kyra fired a plasma shot. The blast passed right through the creature, like it wasn't fully there. The shadow lunged. Daniel barely dodged, dragging the survivor with him. Kyra slammed the medical bay doors shut, sealing them inside. The creature pounded against the metal, its whispers turning to a deep, furious growl. Daniel braced against the door, his heart hammering. All right. That's new. The survivor coughed, his voice weak. You can't fight it. It's not from here. Kyra narrowed her eyes. Then where is it from? The man shuddered. Outside time. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. You're saying this thing isn't real. The man's breathing was ragged. It was a zenith experiment, a way to create soldiers beyond reality. No physical limits, no fear, no mercy. Kyra paled, but they lost control. The man nodded. The Tempest was the test site. We were the test subjects. Daniel exhaled sharply. That thing is a zenith weapon. The man shivered. It's not just a weapon. It's alive. Kyra's grip on her weapon tightened, and it's still here. Daniel looked at the door, where claw marks were slowly forming in the metal. The shadow on the other side was getting stronger. The injured man grabbed Daniel's wrist. His eyes were wild with desperation. You have to kill the ship. Daniel frowned. What? The man coughed. The Tempest. It's keeping it alive. If you don't shut down the core, it'll never stop. Kyra glanced at Daniel. We need to leave. The man shook his head violently. If you leave, it will follow. His gaze locked onto Daniel. You have to finish what they started. Daniel's chest tightened. There was no easy way out of this. Either they shut down the ship, risking their own lives, or they ran and let a monster escape into the galaxy. Daniel clenched his jaw. He had made too many selfish choices before. He wasn't going to make another one now. He met Kyra's gaze. We destroy the ship. Kyra exhaled sharply, then nodded. Then we better move fast. Daniel turned toward the sealed door, blaster ready. The creature outside let out a low guttural hiss. It knew what they were planning, and it wasn't going to let them leave alive. The ship that refused to die. The Tempest trembled beneath their feet. Daniel gritted his teeth as the walls seemed to shift, shadows slithering unnaturally across the metal. The creature outside the medical bay door was growing stronger. Kyra's violet eyes narrowed. We need to get to the core. Now. The injured man, Lieutenant Hale, according to the faded name tag on his uniform, let out a weak laugh. Easier said than done. Daniel holstered his blaster. Then let's make it happen. With a deep breath, he slammed the emergency override on the door controls. The metal hissed open. The shadow lunged immediately. Daniel dived forward, rolling past its grasp. Kyra fired, but the plasma rounds phased through the creature, barely slowing it down. The ship moaned like a living thing. The corridors seemed to twist and shift, reality warping with each step they took. This wasn't just a monster. The Tempest itself was rejecting them. The core of the forgotten. They raced through the corridors, each turn bringing new horrors. Frozen crew members, their eyes open but lifeless, watching them pass. Flickering holograms, distorted memories of the past, playing on endless loops. The ship's voice whispering warnings. Hale staggered forward, his breath ragged. We're almost there. Then, a new door appeared, one that hadn't been there a second ago. Daniel's stomach twisted. That's not right. Kira grabbed his arm. Nothing here is right. They stepped inside. The Tempest's core chamber stretched before them, a massive room filled with pulsing, unnatural light. And at the center, the true horror stood waiting. The entity's truth. The shadow wasn't just a creature. It was the crew. Or at least, what was left of them. Faces floated within the mass, their eyes hollow, mouths opening in silent screams. The darkness shifted and pulsed, reforming into new limbs, new shapes. It wasn't hunting them. It was them. Kyra's breath hitched. They didn't die. Hale's voice shook. They became part of it. The Tempest's failed experiment had fused the crew into one being. The ship hadn't just locked them in. It had consumed them. The final decision. It had consumed them. The final decision. The ship's automated voice crackled to life. Warning. A final POR2FOCOL active. A countdown appeared on the core's display. 10 o'clock minutes until FULSOSTM reboot. Daniel's mind raced. What happens at 0? Hale swallowed. It wakes up fully. Kyra's fists clenched. And then, Hale's face was grim. Then it won't stay here. Daniel understood immediately. This thing, this entity, it wanted more. If the reboot finished, the Tempest would break free from the nebula, carrying the monster with it. It wouldn't just haunt this graveyard. It would spread. Daniel's pulse pounded. There was only one way to stop it. He turned to Kyra. We destroy the ship. Kyra's violet eyes flickered with emotion. Are you sure? Daniel nodded. This thing shouldn't exist. Hale hesitated. There's no coming back from this. Daniel set his jaw. Then we make sure it counts. The last fight. The entity screamed. The ship shuddered violently, metal groaning as the walls began collapsing in on themselves. The countdown ticked lower. Kyra hacked into the core, preparing the overload. Daniel held off the entity, dodging as the shadows lashed out. Hale, barely standing, dragged himself to the emergency beacon, preparing their only way out. The shadows coiled around Daniel's arm, cold as death. Visions flooded his mind. A war he didn't remember. A ship burning in the void. His own face, standing with Zenith scientists. The entity's voice whispered in his mind. We remember you. We remember what you did. Daniel's breath caught. What? What are you talking about? You were the first. You were one of us. His head pounded. His vision blurred. Then, Kyra's voice cut through. Daniel. He snapped back to reality. The core was overloading. 30 seconds left. Hale activated the beacon. The starfall is locking onto us. We have to go. Daniel took one last look at the shrieking mass of darkness. It knew him. Somehow, it knew him. But now wasn't the time for answers. He turned and ran. The end of the Tempest. The trio sprinted to the hangar, barely making it as the core detonated. The Starfall's teleport beacon engaged, and they vanished. Behind them, the Tempest collapsed inward, folding like a dying star. For the first time in 50 years, the whispers stopped. The ship was gone. Aftermath. And one last question. The Starfall drifted silently, far from the nebula. Daniel sat in the cockpit, staring at his reflection in the glass. Kyra stood behind him. You okay? Daniel exhaled. No. Kyra sat beside him. It said it knew you. Daniel nodded. Kyra's voice was soft. Do you think it was lying? Daniel clenched his fists. No. Kyra studied him. So what does that mean? Daniel's eyes flickered toward the Zenith drive still in his pocket. He had come looking for answers. But the truth had been waiting for him all along. He met Kira's gaze. It means this isn't over. The end.